Good morning. Welcome everybody to meeting number 2, the ongoing statutory review of the Lobbying Act. And I want to welcome our witnesses. Before we proceed, I just want to advise the committee that the Commissioner has confirmed that she is available to come the second hour on Thursday, February the 16th, which is what we had agreed to. We have not yet been able to confirm an appearance by the Minister. We have proposed 3 dates, and at this point the Minister is not available on any of those dates and has not come back with an alternative date. We will, as usual, start with our witnesses, and each of our witnesses will have 10 minutes to present. I'm sorry, Mr. Andrews.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just a question. Is there any interest in reviewing if we're going to go back and maybe invite the RCMP to come as well? I know there's been some discussion. We've had a few questions on it. Is it willing that maybe we revisit that one and see if it's an option?
Mr. Andrews, I wonder if we could defer that discussion. There has been a notice of motion, which I think all committee members will have received, which does raise that issue around the RCMP. So if we could defer that discussion until the motion is before committee. Which will be Tuesday. Okay. So back to the witnesses. The witnesses will each have 10 minutes to present, and as usual, for the witnesses' information, when members, the first round is 7 minutes of questioning from the members, which will include the member's question and the witness's response. If I could ask the witnesses to allow the technician to control your mics, that makes the technician's job a lot easier. And we've agreed to start with Ms. Yates. So Ms. Yates, your 10 minutes.
Bonjour. J'aimerais d'abord remercier le comité.
Good morning. I would first of all like to thank the committee for allowing me to express myself here today on this issue. At the outset, we can say that the Lobbying Act, as adopted in 2008, is working well, since most lobbyists submit to it in good faith, and the Registry of Lobbyists is a relevant, credible, accessible, and useful source of information. 4 years after the adoption of this Act, we must see that there are still problems. Even if they relate to marginal situations, there's a lot of cynicism and suspicion on the part of people vis-à-vis what happens in politics. This review of the Act is therefore a wonderful opportunity to
allow the interpreter to keep up.
Sure. So, la révision statutaire de la loi.
Yes, the statutory review of the Act is therefore a wonderful opportunity to improve lobbying, the framework around it, in order to reestablish confidence. My intervention will relate to 3 problems with the present Act: the still revolving doors, the fact that some lobbying activities are not supervised, and a lack of registration and examination of certain lobbying activities. First of all, the still revolving doors. This is a phenomenon that refers to the professional movement of public office holders, POHs, into sectors that they were responsible for while in office, or the reverse, when professionals from this sector move to being public office holders. This phenomenon is generally associated with the creation of an influence network that can obtain benefits for its members, particularly through access to inside information from outgoing POHs or the complacency of incoming POHs towards the sector they will be called upon to regulate and in which they were previously employed. Certain regulatory bodies have tried to capture these problems, and there is a waiting period for doing lobbying in sectors that were previously regulated by these people. The Lobbying Act seems to be the strictest in the world in this regard, as it imposes a 5-year waiting period on designated public office holders. However, it seems that beneath this harsh veneer, there are major gaps, such that the spirit of the Act is regularly violated because of an extremely narrow definition of what constitutes a lobbying activity. The Lobbying Act focuses on oral and organized communication with a POH. As a result, a former POH who uses inside knowledge of a file to establish a political strategy for a given client and prepares that client for a possible meeting with one or more POHs would not be lobbying under the restricted definition of the Act so long as the former POH does not communicate personally with the POH in question. It seems quite clear that in such a situation the client would have a leg up on competitors by having access either to inside information or informal information that fosters the relationship with the POH being lobbied. We believe that this situation is contrary to the spirit of the Act, especially the logic behind establishing post-employment rules. And this has brought about a redefinition of what constitutes lobbying, and I'll come back to that. I would like, secondly, to deal with the matter of activities not included in the Registry of Lobbyists. Under the Lobbying Act, paid lobbyists must register their lobbying activities in the Registry of Lobbyists if lobbying is a significant part of their overall duties, and this cutoff was established as being 20%. In her first 5-year report, the Commissioner of Lobbying mentions her concern about the effects of the 20% rule, which would be a major obstacle to transparency, as a number of lobbyists are choosing not to register their activities on the basis they do not reach this 20% threshold. To rectify the problem, the Commissioner recommends eliminating the significant part principle so that any lobbying activity must be registered. Moreover, to ensure that eliminating this threshold does not restrict access to POHs for organizations that are poorly equipped to comply with the registration rules, the Commissioner suggests introducing certain exemptions allowing these groups not to register. For example, charitable organizations. We have serious reservations about these exceptions. The Quebec legislature took this approach, excluding from the Act in Quebec any person whose job or function consists even substantially in lobbying on behalf of an association or other nonprofit group not constituted to serve management. The result is selective transparency and widespread suspicion for nonprofit organizations, while nonprofit organizations are deemed virtuous in advance. In the spirit of the Quebec law, these organizations do not engage in lobbying. They advocate for the common good, and this is a position that we contest. Clearly, an exclusion system would be moving backward for transparency. It seems to us that we must instead cast off this view, and we believe that efforts must be made to compensate for this. We therefore believe that we should broaden the definition of lobbying to include consulting, etc. The definition of lobbying in the American Act could be a model in this regard, referring both to contacts and to efforts made to gain access. If we adopted a similar definition, the Canadian legislator would also respond to the Commissioner's recommendations regarding the 20%. This broadened definition would allow us to have access in preparatory stages. Salaried lobbyists that circumvent this obligation to register, arguing that they don't meet the threshold of 20%, would be required to do so. We might believe that this change wouldn't increase the burden for small organizations such as community organizations, charitable organizations, whose main task is not to do lobbying. So it would be a net progress with regard to the Act. However, a broadened definition would also have a perverse effect by increasing the work for political advisors, etc., who are susceptible to do preparatory work in view of lobbying efforts for their superiors, without their research necessarily being founded on privileged access information. By broadening the definition of lobbying as suggested here, this preparatory work would not be allowed, and for the 5 years following one's employment. It would be unfortunate that post-employment rules handicap one's career opportunities as political advisors. Therefore, it would be worthwhile to review the definitions of those who must be submitted to the rules, or introducing different threshold periods, waiting periods, depending on the strategic importance of the position held by the POH. Thirdly, I would like to deal with the nature of certain organizations in the Lobbying Act. Most organizations are in a clear-cut situation, but others seem to not be as clearly understood. The lack of transparency is worrying, even on the official platforms of some organizations. We talk about astroturfing. It's a growing phenomenon. And the idea here is to pursue a communication strategy whose true source is hidden and which falsely claims to be citizen-based. In the Canadian context, we have the Mon Choix group, which is a group of citizens that asks for the right to smoke in public places, and it's supported by the manufacturers of cigarettes. These communications are knowingly dishonest. By simply adding to the registry a requirement that organizations reveal their external funding sources when they exceed a certain amount, this would clarify the situation of major donors. Parliament could take concrete action on this issue and provide more transparency. At the federal level in the U.S., the Lobbying Disclosure Act requires disclosure of external funding from any organization that exceeds $5,000. All of our observations taken together lead us to make 3 recommendations to improve the Lobbying Act. First, we recommend that the definition of lobbying activities be expanded to include activities in preparation for communication with public office holders. 2, given this first recommendation, we suggest that the scope of the waiting period be changed to take into account the circumstances of some of these individuals who could see political experience as a major burden to any future career. And thirdly, to increase transparency regarding the background of certain pressure groups, we recommend that the external funding sources of any organization employing a registered lobbyist be included in the information declared in the Registry of Lobbyists when this funding meets a certain threshold. I hope that these remarks will have been helpful to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me to appear before the committee on this review. After writing about lobbying and lobby legislation in Canada and elsewhere for more than 20 years, I've come to the conclusion that reviewing lobby legislation is a bit like taking a long trip with a carload of children. Sooner or later, hopefully later, the inevitable cry of, "Are we there yet?" drifts up from the back of the car. This review of lobby legislation marks the 6th or 7th time, I forget which, that the question, "Are we there yet?" has been posed since the legislation with respect to lobbying was passed into law in 1988. Each review has come to the same conclusion: no, we are not there yet. Part of the reason for that answer is that it has never been clear where the legislation was supposed to take us. We didn't know where we were supposed to go or what was the purpose of lobby legislation. Perhaps the ultimate destination was clear to some, but even then, the way to get there remained a mystery, perhaps because the road to get there hasn't been built yet. Maybe it still doesn't exist. It's like the New England saying, "You can't get to there from here." What have been the course corrections so far? Well, we're requiring more precise, accurate, timely, and current information from lobbyists in each iteration. We've sharpened the definition of lobbying, and we've lengthened the time to charge those in violation of the Act from 6 months to 2 years to 10 years. The purpose of these revisions has been to ensure compliance by changing the definition and lengthening the time to prosecute violations, and to increase transparency. As a result, we do know much more than we knew back in 1988 about who is attempting to influence government. Yet, with all this time and effort, the registry still cannot give a definitive answer as to who is lobbying for whom and for what ends. Perhaps it may never succeed in this regard. Often attempts to strengthen one aspect of lobby legislation entices lobbyists to make use of hitherto unused or unknown avoidance tactics. For example, in the U.S., the last major overhaul of lobby legislation by the previous Congress, spurred on by the Abramoff scandal, led to the disappearance of 3,000 people from the registry of lobbyists, but not, I might add, from the D.C. community of lobbyists. Part of that disappearance from the roster was also due to the Obama administration's effort to ban lobbyists from sitting on advisory boards and panels. In Canada, it would appear that strengthening post-employment guidelines may have led to more use of the 20% rule to avoid registering as lobbyists and avoiding the post-employment ban in the process. Let me say for the record that I concur with the suggestions or recommendations put forward to this committee by the Commissioner of Lobbying, Ms. Shepherd, on December 13th. I think the 20% rule should be suspended, but I also think it would be necessary, as she has suggested, to craft some regulations to prevent a deluge of new registrations. You would not want the removal of the 20% rule to force all those many constituents and others who troop up to your offices day in and day out in the increasing number of lobby days to register as lobbyists. On the other hand, it is important to ensure that while the registry should be free of these foot soldiers, it captures the activities of all those involved in organizing these and other grassroots events. With respect to the enforcement of Rule 8 of the Code of Conflict, which is perhaps the most controversial measure, I think it critically important that this review provide the Commissioner a clear and firm mandate in carrying out this difficult task. I've been a student of public policy making since the 1970s, and whether on or when worked on and off in various government policy units until 1986. When we began publishing the Lobby Monitor in 1989, I was aware that having a lobbyist who was known to be in regular contact with the Prime Minister or the Minister working on behalf of a client involved in a file would have a major impact on how those inside government would handle your file. There is no doubt in my mind that a lobbyist's known connections to political parties matters. They matter to the client and are often used as a major marketing tool. They matter to the public officials involved in the file. If they are not astute enough to recognize that, they shouldn't be where they are. And they certainly matter to the public in terms of their perspective of how government works. We will never be able to sever the connection between the world of government relations and politicians, but it is essential that we moderate it. In my view, the unhealthy situation which existed between 1986 and 2009 was untenable. While it is true that balance may be reached in the internal decision-making process by equalizing opposing lobby forces, that does nothing for the public perception that hiring friends of the party is the way business is done. So in other words, you would often have the situation where people would say, well, they have their lobbyists, we have ours, and it equalizes out. Well, that might equalize out on the inside, but for the outside, it's still the perception that everyone's hiring friends of the government or friends of politicians to get things done, and that is not a healthy perception. Lobby legislation is only one of 4 pieces of the whole that governs the conduct of government. The others are the Conflict of Interest Code that guides the conduct of public servants, the Office of Conflict of Interest and the Ethics in the Commons, and the Office of the Senate Ethics Officer. All of these are essential to the health of our political institutions. Proper enforcement of Rule 8 is, in my view, necessary for the Office of the Commissioner of Lobbyists to fulfill its part in the overall ethics mandate. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions later.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chenier. And Mr. Conacher for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, the committee, for this opportunity to appear before you as the chairperson of the Government Ethics Coalition, which is made up of more than 30 citizen groups from across the country, from various sectors of society, with a total membership of 3 million Canadians. You have the submission of the coalition, 10 pages with 10 key recommendations. What it all adds up to, quite simply, is a simple choice. Will you strongly recommend changes to the Lobbying Act to end secret, unethical lobbying? and to make enforcement effective? Or will you ignore the loopholes and leave them open and not make recommendations to close them or to make enforcement effective? The Act is so full of loopholes, it should not be called the Lobbying Act. It should be called the Some Lobbying by Some Lobbyists Act, because that's all it requires, is disclosure of some lobbying by some lobbyists. And because secret lobbying is legal, unethical lobbying is legal. Secret, unethical lobbying is legal even for cabinet ministers the day after they leave office because of loopholes in the Act. They have to be a bit careful about whom they lobby because of mainly actually rules in the Conflict of Interest Act, not the Lobbying Act. And they have to be a bit careful for whom they lobby and on what they lobby on, but they can lobby cabinet ministers, senior government officials, everyone in the government, opposition parties, and public service, and cabinet appointees and every government institution can lobby the day after they leave office in secret. That's how bad the situation is. There are no valid excuses for failing to close the loopholes and failing to strengthen enforcement. You simply have a choice. Will you endorse, as every committee and every party and every government has endorsed right back to Confederation, secret unethical lobbying and ineffective enforcement? Or will you recommend strongly that the loopholes finally be closed and the enforcement be strengthened so that secret unethical lobbying is illegal? It's not that it will be stopped. People will always try and violate every law that exists. That's not a reason, though, to leave the loopholes open. Some people say you can't legislate morality, and they're twisting that saying. Actually, what that saying means is no matter what you do, some people will be immoral. It doesn't mean you leave loopholes open because some people will be immoral. So you have this choice. This is the 10th committee hearing I've been on this subject, House or Senate, since 1993. No committee has made these recommendations. No government has made the changes. No opposition party has ever introduced a private member's bill, but every party in opposition has complained about secret unethical lobbying. So will you either continue playing the game that's been going on since 1988, or finally clean up your act by making the recommendations that will clean up the Lobbying Act and related laws to finally clean up the federal government? Why should you do this? Well, the Supreme Court of Canada, the Federal Court of Appeal, the UN, the OECD, the World Bank, the IMF, and every other international institution says you don't have a democratic good government if you allow secret unethical lobbying. If that's not reason enough, how about how you look at yourself in the mirror if you're not going to make these recommendations? What will you say to your children and your grandchildren? I had a chance to recommend ending one of the most fundamental problems that undermines democratic good government, but I didn't take that opportunity. And instead, as again every committee has done since '88, I just kept my eyes closed to secret unethical lobbying and pretended that everything was fine. What are the major changes that are needed? Well, the coalition is making 10 recommendations. I'm going to focus on a few of them because the devil truly is in the details. As you've heard the other two speakers and every other witness talk about, there's loopholes that allow for unregistered secret lobbying. Those loopholes must be closed, but some of them haven't been mentioned before the committee. It's not just the 20% rule that is exploited to lobby in secret. It's also that you can lobby about the enforcement or administration of a law, regulation, code, guideline, policy, subsidy, tax, and not register. That's a gigantic loophole. There's tons of lobbying that goes on about enforcement and administration of laws, but no registrations are required for it. Also, the paid-unpaid loophole. It's also a gigantic loophole. All you have to do is arrange to have someone pay you to do other services for them and do the lobbying for free. Lots of people have emphasized over the years that we're worried most about these paid lobbyists. They're the worst. Actually, the unpaid lobbyists are also as bad. Those are the ones you should worry about more in some ways, because those are the cabinet ministers who leave and have their nice gold-plated pension and make a few calls for friends for free. And they have enormous influence on the inside. And they don't have to register because they're unpaid for the lobbying. So you either solve this problem by closing those loopholes, including requiring unpaid lobbying to be registered, or, as the Conservatives promised in 2006, flip the onus and require all of you and everyone in government and every institution and opposition parties, parliament, everyone, staff, everyone, to disclose anyone who communicates with them about their decisions. And the only exception to that, and it's really the way the Act should have been designed in the first place because you wouldn't have these loopholes there, the only exception would be the constituent contacting you about a personal concern every so often. But if they were organized and had a little community group and were pushing, it would be disclosed. And then you would capture it all, and secret unethical lobbying would be ended because secret lobbying would be illegal, and therefore unethical lobbying would be illegal. To turn to the cooling off period, it was extended in kind of a blunt move that's a bit unfair to all MPs, this 5-year cooling off period. It should be changed into a sliding scale, and it would depend if you're a backbench MP not on a committee, then you would sit out a certain length of time. It should run from 1 year to 5 years. It should cover staff of all politicians as well, because they're not covered by any ethics rules at all right now. And it would just depend. If you were on a committee, if you chaired a committee, if you were parliamentary secretary, you'd go up this scale from 1 to 5 years. That's the fair change to make. The fact that a backbench MP that doesn't even sit on a committee has to sit out 5 years after they leave, the same length of time as a cabinet minister, that doesn't make sense. So that change should be made, but you should not lower the 5-year limit. 5 years is appropriate for a cabinet minister and senior government officials. It's a length of time that's needed to have a changeover in government that you hope for, so that their influence and their access is not as potent as it is when they first leave. You should also, in the enforcement area, change the Act to require the Commissioner to conduct regular random audits and inspections. The Commissioner is sitting back too much and waiting for complaints and not proactively out there checking who's communicating with which institutions. It's just basic law enforcement to be doing random regular inspections. Police officers do it, everyone does it, who is actually enforcing a law. So you have to require the Commissioner to do it, give her the clear power and mandate to do this. As well, in enforcement area, require the Commissioner and the Director of Public Prosecutions to be ruling publicly within a reasonable time period on every situation that raises issues of violations. Currently, if you look back actually to 2004, there's dozens of complaints that still haven't been ruled on. And those complaints, we don't even know who they're about. And often the Commissioner is, from all evidence, rejecting some complaints without ever publicly stating that they've been rejected. The public has a right to know about all the situations that have arisen and what the ruling was by the Commissioner. As well, in enforcement, a key area is giving the Commissioner the power and the mandate to impose penalties. You heard on Tuesday all 4 commissioners from the provinces say that this is necessary, and some are saying it's going to cause some sort of conflict. GRIC the Government Relations Institute of Canada, was complaining that this might cause a conflict where the RCMP would be doing something different and Crown Prosecutors different than the Commissioner. I think they misunderstand. The administrative penalties are there not for the violations of the Act that amount to a crime, but for administrative violations of the Act. So there would not be a conflict in terms of investigations and having the power to levy fines. And if this was allowed, the Commissioner would be able to proceed and make a ruling rather than waiting for the RCMP and Crown Prosecutors to bounce it around for 3, 4, 5 years before she finally can proceed under the Lobbyist Code.
Mr. Conacher, if I can ask you to wrap up.
Yes, I was going to. Thank you. The penalties should also be there for violations of the Code, not just the Act. To remind you again of another reason why these loopholes need to be closed and the enforcement strengthened. In another context about another law, Prime Minister Harper said on February 26, 2009, it is essential for deterrence to have strong penalties that we all know will be enforced. That's true of all violations of laws, not just being tough on crime, but being tough on undemocratic crimes and violations of laws. So I urge you to uphold that ethic and make it a situation that there will be deterrence, because we know there are strong rules and strong penalties that we all know will be enforced. And I welcome your questions about any of the details of the submission we've made. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Conacher. We'll now go to Mr. Angus for 7 minutes.
Well, thank you. Very interesting presentations this morning. I guess one of the things we've been wrestling with is trying to define, so we have transparency in defining lobbying, because if everybody's a lobbyist, then nobody's a lobbyist. And that's the concern we have as New Democrats, that if everybody that ever comes into my office is treated as a lobbyist, then how's anybody going to go through all the thick woods and figure out who's actually doing the serious business, which is the issue of access to power? That seems to be the fundamental question that has to be addressed. Mr. Shenya, you talked about, it shouldn't be about friends of the party. And that's where, Madame Yates, you talked about the cynicism and suspicion out there. Mr. Shenya, how do we set up a system that, it's never going to be perfect, but it shouldn't be about friends of the party who can make a call and open those doors? That seems to be where we, time and time again, get caught up. So do we have to sweep up every single person in this net to do that, or is there a way we can focus in on ensuring that some people just don't have excessive amounts of access?
Well, I don't. There's two components to this. One is indeed the enforcement of the conflict of rules in the code, Rule 8, I believe it is. And I think the Commissioner has been trying her best to make sure that those people who are involved in partisan politics for any party cannot lobby, or are banned from lobbying certain groups or members, and that is a step in the right direction. The other part is what activities have to be registered, and I share your concern that if every person who walked in your door had to register, then probably the registry would be meaningless, and the important would be lost in the mundane. But there is in my view, a definite cutoff, and that is it organized? And if so, you at least have to get the organizers on the registry and their activities listed on the registry. Again, the lobby days are organized by someone. The people who are coming into your office quite often are organized. They've been trained. They come in with their list of questions or their issues. You're going to be invited to a reception later that evening, and you're going to be talked to again all night by your constituents. You can't. It seems to me anyway. You can't put all their names on the registry, but you can certainly put down that the Railway Association or whatever has organized. X. This is what they organized. These are the people they saw, etc.
Okay. Mr. Conacher, I guess the issue of the revolving door is a real concern for us, because I think what made access to power so disturbing before is if you were a cabinet minister or you were deputy minister, you could set up a little nice egg in the bureau, walk out, go into private practice, come back 4 months later and walk out with the prize, and that was how things were done. Now we have a 5-year rule, and some people say the 5-year rule is not fair, but I think it would send a really bad message to Canadians that we're saying, well, we have a rule, but we want to weaken the rule. Now you talk about a fairness slide so that we ensure that we're not overly penalizing members of Parliament who might want to go back work in whether it's even non-profit sector or that. But you're talking about a sliding scale. So how do we define that sliding scale so that we're not sending a message that we're loosening the real clear rules that were set up under the Accountability Act?
Well, just to say, first of all, they're not real clear rules. There's no 5-year ban. You can lobby the next day. You just have to be careful.
Yes.
Especially in the first 2 years as a minister because of the conflict of interest rules, not the Lobbying Act rules, and 1 year as a senior government official covered by the Conflict of Interest Act. But anybody else, again, you just have to join a corporation and lobby less than 20% of the time. Or if you have a healthy pension or doing other work, lobby for free. And you can do it and you don't have to register. So there is no 5-year ban. It's a 5-year ban on being a registered lobbyist. But yeah, a sliding scale of 1 to 5 years, depending on who you are, is what we're suggesting. And you would just have categories. And so if you were not on a committee, just a backbench MP, you'd sit out for 1 year. But if you joined a committee halfway through your term, then you would be bumped up to 1.5 years or 2 years, and just slide it on up depending on the power, either in the opposition party side. So opposition critics would sit out more than committee members, and on the government side, the parliamentary secretaries would sit out more than the ministers of state, and then the full cabinet ministers. And same with staff. Staff have to be covered. Right now, they're not, except in the leader of the opposition office in terms of opposition parties. And that would really solve things. A lot of people don't realize that just to mention in terms of loopholes and who has to register, the 20% rule is totally different for an NGO, for a nonprofit, or any type of organization. At an organization, you have to count up all of the time that your staff spends lobbying and pretend you're one person. So if you have 5 staff and they each spend 4.1% of their time lobbying, that's 5 times 4.1% crosses the 20% threshold, and all 5 have to be listed in the registration. So the 20% rule has always been there to hide corporate lobbying.
Right,
and NGOs have always had a higher threshold of disclosure, which is perverse because they obviously have less power in most situations than the big business lobbyists.
Madame Yates, you made a really interesting reference to astroturfing, because we see how it is completely distorting the public discourse. And, you know, perfect example is Ethical Oil, a total front organization. It seems to be a revolving door between the PMO's office and key cabinet ministers and this front group. But my question is does that come under lobbying? Because it seems that their job is to distort public discourse, as opposed to, they don't actually need to call the minister because they pretty much have worked for them. So how do we put the issue of AstroTurf organizations, do they come under this, or is this a separate issue that has to be addressed?
A brief response, Ms. Yates.
Je pense que
I believe that, in fact, indeed, there are certain activities that these groups that don't come under the sphere of lobbying. They do lobbying that we could qualify as indirect, raising awareness of the media that then can make DPOHs aware of certain activities. But when they communicate with public office holders, and it happens, I'm thinking of Friends of Science that was very active, for example, when that's the case, and this requires registration as a lobbyist, it would be very easy to simply add a line to the register, a field, where they would specify what their sources, their major sources of funding are. So no, it wouldn't allow us to bring that to light completely, but it would at least allow us to lift one little part of the curtain, hiding them when they're doing lobbying very actively.
Astro for 7 minutes.
Thanks very much, Madam Chairman. I'd actually like to pick up on this question of astroturfing, as you've suggested. I think it's a tremendous recommendation you're making in this regard, because I do think groups should have to demonstrate who is funding them. If they appear to be a public interest group that's actually funded by, especially money outside the country, I think that Canadians have a need to be able to see that so that they can understand what might be motivating that position. Is there a specific recommendation that you would make in this regard? You've indicated that when they register, they should have to indicate where their funding is coming from. But it would seem to me it would have to be some kind of an ongoing process, so that they would have to indicate if they have money come in somewhere down. So at the point of registration, they might not have that money. It might come in at some other point, which could change the nature of that lobby group. How would you do that? Do you have a specific recommendation on that?
ben, si on regarde l'exemple américain,
If we look at the American example, groups must provide this information and update it quarterly. So every 3 months, if they've received funding from a source, a different source above $5,000, then they have to update their file. So they do this every 3 months.
In on that briefly?
Well, I have a second question,
Okay.
and I'd be happy to have Mr. Conacher make a comment on that. You and Mr. Conacher both talked about the scope of the waiting period. We heard his recommendations on it, and I'll rephrase the question to him once I have your answer. But what is it that you're proposing in that regard?
Mais en fait, et ça revient un peu à la...
In fact, this comes back to the issue we covered earlier, how to sell politically the idea of having a scale that would go from 1 to 5 years. I agree completely with that proposal of the sliding scale. And to my mind, if we broaden the definition of what constitutes a lobbying activity, then it would be easier to sell this politically, to say, instead of sweeping broadly so that several activities that aren't considered to be lobbying are covered, then let's broaden the definition of lobbying, and let's then have different waiting periods to ensure that those who carry out broad lobbying, including activities of preparatory work, exploratory work, research, strategic advice, etc., let's include all of that in the basket. And once you've done that, then let's vary the waiting periods, the cooling off periods, based on the strategic role played by the public office holder. Because indeed it isn't logical that a political advisor who works for the leader of the opposition be submitted to the same rules as a minister, a former minister who sat on cabinet.
In part, I've heard people make the argument, and in some ways you witness it here on the Hill, that when you put restrictions in place, like a 5-year waiting period, it does have an impact on who applies for jobs here on the Hill, because they begin to worry about their future earning potential and so forth. One of the things that's been recommended, and I'd be interested in getting your view on this, because perhaps what you're suggesting could work in tandem with an administrative monetary penalty. So if you put in place a sliding scale and people understand what that is, so they understand what the restriction is on them, if you were to put in place an administrative monetary penalty so that the commissioner had some teeth in the rules, do you see that these could work in tandem towards a positive kind of outcome?
Oh, very much so. But I would say about this rumor that people are not becoming staff of ministers because of the 5-year ban is a rumor. There's never been a case that anyone has ever come forward and said, I didn't join the government because of the rule. So it's, there's no evidence that that is discouraging anyone. In fact, when it was a minority government situation, I think what would discourage people is they don't know when there's going to be an election. They don't know whether they'll still have a job in 2 years. Are you really going to move to Ottawa, move your family, become a senior staffer, when you have a situation that's so unsure? Because it could last, 1 year, 1.5 years. That's far more likely to be a reason why people may not have joined Conservatives' cabinet minister offices as staff after these measures came in. So I don't think there's any evidence that 5 years is too long, but I think it is too long for MPs, and it shouldn't be the same standard. And so, yeah, sliding scale with the administrative monetary penalties would be a good combination. And just to mention, when you're talking about disclosure of funding, Democracy Watch's and the Coalition's recommendation is also should be disclosure of how much you spend on a campaign. And when you're asking about updates, there's a requirement for organizations to update any changes in their registration every 6 months already. That could be moved to quarterly, as in the U.S., but you would at least know every 6 months whether new money had come in if you put in this requirement to disclose funding sources.
Does Democracy Watch have to register?
No, I actually deregistered a decade ago in protest.
So you don't actually lobby?
In protest of the loopholes.
Okay.
I had been before committee 3 times. 3 times the government had said we're not going to close these loopholes. I'm not required to register. And I was the only staff person. I wasn't lobbying more than 20% of my time. And I said before a Senate committee, actually, at one time, I have deregistered. I'm not going to register again until you close the loopholes. I'm not going to just register out of the goodness of my heart when all sorts of other people are out there doing secret unregistered lobbying.
So some might say that you're not really holding up to your own standard.
It's a protest against the loopholes, and I went
It's a
public with
protest
it.
against your own standard.
No, it's not. My
Okay.
standard is require all the lobbying to be disclosed by law, and if you're not going to, then don't expect people to register, and don't expect me to register. So I did it as a civil action protest against the loopholes in the law and the continuing ignorance of those loopholes and failure to close them.
Mr.
15 seconds,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Del Mastro.
Mr. Chenier, you said the question that keeps coming up is, are we there yet? What is the destination in your view that we should be heading toward?
A brief response, Mr. Chenier.
Total transparency in the policy process would be the short answer, 15-second answer.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Andrews for 7 minutes.
Madam Chair, and welcome, folks, for coming today. Mr. Chenier, I'm going to start with you. And you talked about in your presentation about knowing the client, and the clients are well aware of which lobbyists are connected with which political parties, and obviously they further their careers by doing this. And you see a lot of lobbyists who are commentators on these radio shows. Some of them actually go out of their way to do commentary. Some of the lobbyists actually get paid to do commentary, and the more commentary they do, the more connected they seem they are. And how do you balance that? And I guess this is where Rule 8 comes in, is what rules, or how do we curtail that, or how do we legislate that you can't do this? Like, it's a real gray area. I don't know if you could help us out there a little bit. Do you get my drift?
Well, I get your drift, and that is probably the thorniest problem that the commissioner has to deal with. Is you've dealt with war rooms, and you've dealt with working on campaigns and being part of campaign teams, but when you get to this region of, well, I'm a spokesperson for the party on the media, this is obviously a difficult situation. My own view would be that if you wish to be a spokesperson, you shouldn't be a lobbyist. That's just out and out. That's the way it should be.
And then some people say I'm official spokesperson or not the official spokesperson.
Doesn't matter. If you're there representing the party, the views of the party, then you're perceived as being sort of for the party.
Can we put that in the Lobbying Act, that they would not allow to do that?
Well, again, it comes back to how does the commissioner interpret Rule 8 and the Code of Conflict, or Conflict of Interest, rather. And again, she went down that path with previously before the election, and she's been challenged on this notion that if I'm a spokesperson for the party on the media, I'm not really a spokesperson. I've just been invited by the media, and I'm not really a representative of the
Well, some of them are
party.
getting paid by the media to do this.
Oh yes, of course you get paid by the media to do this. Yes, you're supposed to, and that's not the problem. The problem isn't that the media pays them. It's the fact that they represent the party, and they also lobby, and they represent the party in a very public stance, and everyone knows that, and it's used in the marketing material.
Pretty good advertising.
It's pretty good advertising, right? It seems to me if you want to be a commentator on political affairs, that's fine. Just don't be a lobbyist. Would be my view.
Okay. Ms. Yates, I want to go back to we started talking about broadening the definition of lobbying, and in particular, you touched on government relation firms, and in my opinion, they don't lobby, but they do. And we're talking about DPOHs, if they go to a government relations firm and they advise clients on how to do things, it's not really lobbying because they don't make that contact, but there's significant gain there for their clients, and it sort of crosses over with the conflict of interest rules. How do we square the circle? How is broadening the definition will cut down on that? Like how? I'm finding it difficult to find out how to pinpoint that one. Do you understand what
I'm not sure I understand the question. You mean if you broaden the definition, what would be the purpose effect?
Would you catch that? Would you catch those people who don't actually lobby but wield more influence? Was that your recommendation?
Je pense que oui. Et si on regarde la...
Yes, I believe so. And if we look at the American definition, we're really talking about contact, so communication directly with public office holders. But we're also talking about the whole effort before those contacts in preparation for them. So certainly the Act would have to sanction those who don't do this. With that definition, with a broadened definition, we would have to accompany that with a power to impose sanctions, a stronger power, a firmer power, because otherwise it would be up to the goodwill of the lobbyists to say, well, I'm not establishing any contacts, but in the work that I do, it is lobbying because I am preparing for a contact with someone. So they would have to declare that themselves. How would we go about ensuring that the register includes that information? Well, that's where the commissioner should have a stronger power to sanction in order to verify that this preparatory work is registered, is divulged. And if it isn't the case, then the commissioner should be able to impose sanctions. So to be clear, I think it would require that measure, that definition, and the system that works well in the U.S. that could be enforced here, as long as the commissioner has a real power to sanction, has teeth.
Commissioner of Conflict of Interest, if a former public officer goes to them, gets cleared, but from being in a conflict of interest, should the two commissioners work together in any sort of fashion to make sure that there's no loophole here, or?
Ça pourrait être une avenue, ça revient un peu à la...
It could be an avenue. This brings us back to the question of asking if public office holders should also register their lobbying activities that they participate in when they're lobbied. And perhaps there could be some collaboration, but to my mind, we have to be careful. If we want to submit public office holders to the obligation to divulge lobbying activities, that could increase the burden, the bureaucratic burden, if we have rules that affect public office holders and if they do have to register their own lobbying activities.
You mentioned several times about loopholes and closing these loopholes, and I was finding it a little bit difficult to actually pinpoint the loopholes you're talking about. You talk about the 20% rule, and then first of all, have you read the commissioner's recommendations to us? There, are you familiar with all of her recommendations?
Yes.
If we enacted all those recommendations from the commissioner, would that close the loopholes that you were talking about?
No, because you would still have open the loophole that if you're unpaid, you can lobby in secret. And that's very dangerous because cabinet ministers leave, they have a healthy pension, or they get some other job, and then friends call them and they make calls for their friends and they don't charge their friends. And that's very influential lobbying because they've just left cabinet, they know all the people, and they have to be careful for a couple of years under the Conflict of Interest Act, but they don't have to register the lobbying. And then secondly...
Okay, we'll come, I think we'll come back to that.
Yeah, if I can just say,
yes, please.
If you lobby about the enforcement or administration of a law, regulation, or program, you also don't have to register, and the commissioner has not touched that with her recommendations. But you do have to look at, in terms of a cooling off period and these rules, at the Conflict of Interest Act, and we'll be applying to come back to the committee to talk about that. It affects what you've just talked about with the other witnesses as well. There is a rule that a former public office holder can never share information that they learned while on the job with a client. That rule is not being enforced under the Conflict of Interest Act. And if it was, these people who are being hired to just give advice but not actually do the lobbying would not be doing their jobs, because that's why they're hired. They're hired to give that secret information that they learned on the job.
Thank you, Mr. Conacher. Mr. Mays for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Our government since 2006 have tried to address this, and I think we've made great strides in trying to provide citizens a more open and transparent government. And you know, just this exercise today proves that we're serious about this and trying to improve the Lobbying Act. All of you are experts in this field. I'm just wondering, is there any models in other countries that you have observed that you feel are good models, or are we leading the way as far as lobbying? Mr. Chenier?
Ooh, there are so many different ways that different countries have approached this, and the one common feature is that there's always resistance from the lobby community. You know, I've been watching Europe for the last 10 years, where they have been trying to institute some sort of lobby laws, and the lobbying community there is growing like topsy, especially in Brussels and the European community. But there's always great resistance. Similarly, when you pass a law, it's hard to judge the law without judging the application of the law, or what has been the result. And so, for example, I could say the law passed in the U.S. By the last Congress, after some terrible scandals, went quite a ways. You know, they have fee disclosure, they have a stronger definition of lobbying and things like that. But it's still there's obviously mass avoidance taking place. They have conflict of interest rules as well, but they get around that. So to point to particular legislation, I think you could say the ideal legislation is one thing, but how it's played out or how it's enforced is usually a totally different can of
Speak to that.
Mr. Conacher?
The problem with all the provinces that have implemented the laws, they follow the federal model. And this has generally been done around the world, where the lobbyist is required to disclose lobbying. And then the problems have always been, what's the definition of a lobbyist? What's the definition of lobbying? Huge loopholes. The way it should have always been done, and no country's done this, is reverse the onus and have the people in government, in all the parties, all the staffers, disclosing anyone who communicates to them about their decisions. And then you don't run into all these problems, because whether the person who is doing the communication is paid or unpaid, or doing it 20% of their time or 100% of their time, or whether it's oral or prearranged communication, doesn't matter, any type of communication. So you could reverse the whole onus, that would help, or you close the loopholes. And I think you can close all the loopholes without any danger of capturing your constituents just contacting you every so often about a policy concern, by just putting in words like someone who plays a significant role, paid or unpaid, in an organized effort. And if they communicate with you in any way, then they have to register. And then you'd have a much better system that would essentially end secret unethical lobbying. And put in a couple of other rules specifically for anyone who has been in government. Because an individual calling on behalf of a friend is not an organized effort. It's just a casual call. Right. But you definitely want to cover those people, because, again, cabinet ministers are very influential when they leave, and they usually can get other jobs, and they don't need to be paid to do lobbying. And if you don't close that loophole, they won't be captured, and you really want to capture them.
Yes, sir. I just want to add, it's not only who, but it's what they're doing. So it goes beyond just having their name on the registry. That's essentially what we had in 1989, is the name on the registry. It's also who they're seeing and what they're doing and why they're doing it, which is the important part of the transparency as well. And so how much information do you require from the lobbyist in terms of their activities, who they're seeing? And I must say that the last modification of the Act took a giant step in forcing the disclosure of who they're seeing. Now, you still don't know who was all there at the meeting, and you don't know what they were really talking about. So in terms of transparency, we still got a way to go. But it's the activity as well as the people that is very important in any legislation.
Would you know, is there ethical lobbying and unethical lobbying? For instance, healthy lobbying, because that's, whether you're sitting as a mayor getting reports from staff on issues and making decisions from those reports, that's kind of lobbying you as elected official. Then you have people today, they can access you through the internet, send you reports on their position, and so you're being lobbied again, but I value that. Mm-hmm. So I can look at these issues and balance them out and understand both sides of the issues on any given subject. So is it not more important to discern the unethical lobby where they're saying, okay, if you do this for me or implement this, you're going to see support politically or financially of some sort of benefit. I mean, how do you discern that, and especially with the technology today and the access that they have to the public office holder?
The difficulty
I'd
is,
like
though,
to hear from Madam Yates first, if you don't mind, if she hasn't had an opportunity.
Mais peut-être, juste avant de répondre à la question.
Before answering your question, I would like to come back to the first question. Are there examples elsewhere in the world that might inspire us? I agree that there isn't necessarily a perfect law, a perfect act anywhere, but to come back to the American example, the definition of lobbying adopted by the American legislator seems to be a very good one, including preparatory work, strategic advice, calls that aren't officially, formally lobbying activities per se, but that fit into this influence-making work. And people are very cynical when they see a former minister leave and the next day become a strategic advisor and not a lobbyist for a consulting firm. So without saying that the American model is the model to follow with regard to the definition of lobbying, I believe that there is a very worthwhile and interesting element. And to come back to the ethical versus non-ethical lobbying question, I believe that there is a risk of going adrift. I believe that Canadian legislation must table on transparency. We'll reach that once it's really transparent with regard to ethical or non-ethical activities for both of them. And in that sense, if we say that certain activities carried out by community organizations or charitable organizations are ethical by definition and shouldn't be registered, well, that could lead us adrift. And this is why it's the transparency issue that must dominate this debate.
Allow a very brief response from Mr. Chenier and Mr. Conacher. Mr. Chenier.
Just 2 points. One, it's easier in the U.S. to define lobbying because lobbying is not tax deductible. And so therefore national or custom revenue has defined what is lobbying and what is lobbying activity, and therefore expenses are not tax deductible. The other thing is, it's not a question of ethical or unethical. It's a question of people having the choice of whether they want to register the activity or not. And it still remains that people can make that choice. They can skirt the law. They can decide, I'm going to go this way so I don't have to register or be visible in the process.
Thank you, Mr. Chenier. Mr. Conacher, please,
Yes.
briefly.
Yes, just if you don't have full transparency, if you leave a loophole open, then it will be exploited by unethical lobbyists. So get the full transparency, close all the loopholes, and then the public will decide and be able to track whether unethical lobbying is happening.
Thank you, Mr. Conacher. Monsieur Dussault, pour 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Alors, j'aimerais...
For 5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, a question for Ms. Yates. You often talked about preparatory work in advance of lobbying per se, so everything that's done ahead of time when someone wants to contact a public office holder. And it reminds me of the story of Stockwell Day. And I think you alluded somewhat to it, not directly, but it was the matter of a minister. The individual was a minister and then went to the private sector to do preparatory work or consulting work, trying to show lobbyists how to do their work. Do you believe that that should be regulated? Because my impression is that these individuals can open a lot of doors and are able to exercise a lot of influence without necessarily doing the lobbying themselves, but giving advice as to who to lobby. Indeed, with regard to ministers, citizens are very suspicious, and I didn't mention that example specifically in my brief, but I did mention a Quebec example, a recent one, and it's that type of situation that makes people become very cynical with regard to the political arena. So I think that if we readjust the definition of lobbying, we will indeed be able to include that kind of preparatory work, that strategic work under the definition of lobbying, in which case those individuals would be subject to the rules, the 5-year threshold rule, and indeed people would fulfill their work differently, and I think this would revitalize our political system and would give confidence back to citizens with regard to the political world. And how would it be revealed or divulged? Would it be the lobbyist who was briefed by a consultant who would make a report? With regard to the ways of reporting, we would have to ask the legislator to look at this further to see how this might be done. But in the rules, the 5-year rule says that you couldn't do this or you can't do this because this constitutes lobbying, so there wouldn't be any reporting because it wouldn't be included. Another question for Mr. Conacher in another context altogether. I didn't hear you speak about meetings that are social in nature, that aren't necessarily pre-planned. I'm thinking, for example, of the Albany Club, where Conservatives ministers meet quite regularly. And they say that it's for social interests and that they don't discuss political files per se. Do you believe that these type of encounters, and that's just an example I've given, the Albany Club, but do you believe that these activities should be more regulated and divulged? Thank you for your question. Practicing my French, but I will respond in English.
That our decisions have to be disclosed. That's the rule that should be in place. And it's very important. And again, if the promise had been kept in 2006, the promise by the Conservatives was that ministers and senior public officials will be required to disclose their contacts with lobbyists. Contacts meaning all communications, and instead only oral and prearranged communications are required to be disclosed. Not everyone who's at the meeting has to be disclosed. The commissioners talked about that and others. And yes, any conversation, any type of communication that's about decisions, that has to be the rule, that it has to be disclosed on the registry in the communication reports. Okay, otherwise, if you allow that loophole open, again, you're not going to stop it all. You're not going to stop the conversations on the back nine of the golf course. No one's ever going to be able to stop those, but make it illegal at least to not register and disclose those conversations.
Merci. Puis pour poser finalement.
Thank you. And finally, a question from Mr. Chenier. I have a question relating to the RCMP and its follow-up on files that the Commissioner brings to it. And in all cases, there was no follow-up. Would you have comments to make on that work, the RCMP's work? And should we allow the Commissioner to have some inquiry powers in order to refer everything always back to the RCMP?
On all counts. One, all the cases that have been referred to the RCMP in the past, including the first one that we referred way back in 1992 or 93, have been dropped for one reason or another, one technicality or another. Either it was unpaid lobbying or it was beyond the terms of, the first one was a 6-month rule, it was beyond 6 months, and then it was beyond 2 years, which is why we have the 10-year rule now that you can investigate and lay charges on breaches to the Act. Many of these are not what you would call serious to the RCMP at any rate, enough to warrant a lot of resources. And so giving the Commissioner power to both, I concur with what Mr. Conacher said of being proactive, actually going out and doing audits in terms of whether the activities and the registrations match, and more powers to investigate and have administrative penalties, I think would do wonders for the Act.
Thank you, Mr. Chenier. Your time is up, Mr. Dussault. Mr. Dreeshen for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I guess just a couple of points. First of all, there was a comment made by my colleague about Stockwell Day and the work that he was doing. I suggest that when you have someone that is trying to show people how they should be following the rules so that they aren't being accused of being secret and unethical lobbyists, I know that he would understand what that situation is. So when we just throw that out as an example of something that's bad, I think this is actually an example that would enhance the type of things that you folks are talking talking about. And if there are changes that come, one would assume that would also be part of what someone in his position would perhaps talk about. The other part that I wanted to mention, just to go back to what your comments were about, backbenchers, that whether or not they become on committees, and if they are, that there should be a 4 or 5 year or whatever time frame before they or their 20-year-old staffers that come to them with them to the committees. I don't think that people should be led to believe that that is an occasion that happens once in a while. We are on, all backbenchers are on at least one committee, most of us on 2 committees, so that you recognize the gravity of what you are saying. It isn't just an occasional thing that backbenchers do. And I guess the other aspect, I know that Madam Yates, you had spoke about groups where contributions over a certain sum of money, that you felt that was important, that be emphasized, and if it be, that there be updates in case there are more, that there are dollars coming in from different groups and organizations. So I think that's perhaps another issue that I wouldn't mind getting a little bit more information on. So I know that Mr. Conacher, you had a comment first, so if you wanted to start.
Sure. When this committee looks at the Conflict of Interest Act, which I imagine it'll be soon on your agenda because its 5-year review deadline is coming up, you will have this issue of looking at this rule that says that former public office holders covered by that act are never allowed to give advice to any client ever using information that they learned on the job that is not accessible to the public. And that's the question to ask about what people like Stockwell Day are doing. Are they giving advice without using any of the information that is not accessible to the public that they learned while as a cabinet minister? And also, what is being done to enforce that rule? The Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner is not doing any audits, and also former public office holders don't even have to inform her when they leave office. So she doesn't even know where they've gone and what they're doing in many cases. So it's actually a Conflict of Interest Act rule, but that's why I urge you to change not just the Lobbying Act, but also relevant and related changes to the other laws, because these 2 laws very much work together. And there are some conflicts in between them now, and lots of questions about enforcement on both sides.
Madam Yates,
Oui, ben en fait, pour revenir peut-être avec...
Yes, to come back with another example, perhaps indeed, when we talk about the cynicism of citizens, their suspicions vis-à-vis politicians, transparency would be helped if lobbyists had to divulge their sources of funding. A recent example we've heard about in the media is the group Friends of Science, presented as a group that contests the role of man in climate change, a group that has links with the University of Calgary, made up of scientists, researchers from the University of Calgary. And what we've learned is that that group was funded in part by Talisman, a company, an energy company. So this type of situation, it is believed, feeds the suspicion of citizens vis-à-vis politicians and politics. And you could simply add a field to the register saying, if you register as a group that does lobbying, then reveal what your important sources of funding are, and say who provides funding and who has an impact on the lobbying work that you're undertaking. It's a simple change that could contribute to responding to the citizens' suspicions and appease.
Well, thank you. And I guess, well, then I really don't have enough time to go back into a lot of this. But Mr. Conacher, when you suggest the concept of transparency and you look at suspicion, you have already indicated that because you choose not to register, that you are suggesting that you feel there's something wrong. Are there other people in your organization then that do lobbying that you demand that they follow the rules, or is this simply something that you do yourself?
No, as I mentioned, I was the only staff person. I'm now a board member of Democracy Watch, and I very publicly stated that because 3 attempts, and I've been here 3 times pointing out the loopholes, and the government refused each time, that I was going to deregister because I didn't have to be registered, until the loopholes were closed, I would not register again.
Th-
And I've then
thank-
been before committee 3 more times, and every time the committee and governments have continued to ignore the loopholes
Thank you,
and allow
Mr.
secret
Conacher.
unethical lobbying.
Thank you, Mr. Conacher. The time is well up. Monsieur Morin for 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One thing is clear. As Mr. Conacher mentioned, there are too many loopholes in this act, and I could even place blame on the previous Conservative and Liberal governments for their laxism in the area of lobbying. My question is for Ms. Yates. You're very knowledgeable in this field, and with regard to 2010-2011, there are only 5,500 and some lobbyists who are registered under the Canadian Act. Do you believe that there are just 5,500 and some lobbyists in Ottawa who work in Ottawa? We're talking here about the definition of what a lobbying activity is. If we consider lobbying as a communication activity, in other words, contact between a lobbyist and a public office holder, the 5,000 number might be logical. But if we're looking at all of the preparatory work behind the scenes, then indeed this is an industry that hires a lot more people than that. And this is why, to my mind, a broadened definition would allow us to take into account all of those other individuals who work behind the scenes. So real lobbying is much broader than that. So therefore, there are a lot of people who don't register. That's my understanding. Last Tuesday, the commissioner from BC said that when this was set up, the administrative penalties were such that registration under their registry in BC increased by 70%. So I believe that there's also an effect there. When people realize that they aren't forced for various reasons, they find loopholes to not register, they don't do so. To perhaps avoid the paperwork or to avoid getting into trouble. So it's very important, and I believe that you would agree, too, to say that this has to be broadened for that reason. Do you agree also that there should be administrative penalties? Absolutely. And I said that at the end of my brief. I believe that the concerns of the Commissioner are founded. Indeed, she does inquiries, investigations, but there's not necessarily any echo on the side of the RCMP. So this does require an intermediate regime, I think those are the terms she used, in order to impose infractions to the Code of Ethics issues as well. You also mentioned that the elimination of the provisions for the 20% threshold you say that increasing that would be, or reducing that would be good. Do you not believe that that might bring about a major difference between large organizations that devote 100% of their time to these activities and smaller groups that only intervene once or twice in the year? In my brief, I specify that I'm in favor of retaining this notion of a 20% threshold. I think it's important to retain this, to conserve it, in order to target lobbying as it's understood, including the preparatory work, and not the simple citizen who meets twice a year with his or her member of parliament. I think that this threshold is operational, functional. We could retain it, but we could fill in the loopholes by broadening the definition of lobbying. Thank you very much for those explanations. Next question, because we're talking about all of the improvements that we could make to the Lobbying Act, but are there things that should remain unchanged, that work well, that we shouldn't change? Your views on this? I believe that there have been a lot of improvements made during the review of the Act in 2008. The fact that the Commissioner is independent, that's an essential ingredient for the application of the law. And when we compare this with the various registries, we must say that the Canadian registry is quite complete, despite the fact that I do believe that certain fields should be added in order to determine what the funding of certain organizations is. But the registry does include a lot of information, very useful and pertinent information. Mr. Conacher?
Brief thing about administrative penalties. Representative from the Government Relations Institute of Canada, when he testified, and also Joe Jordan, both said that when the commissioner reports that someone's violated the lobbyist code, that's a serious penalty. No one would want to hire that person again. That's simply not a true claim. Michael McSweeney of the Cement Association of Canada was found to violate Rule 8 of the Lobbyist Code of Conduct, and then he was promoted by the association to be president and CEO. Will Stewart, in the same situation, when he was found guilty by the commissioner of violating the code for assisting Lisa Raitt with a fundraising event, I checked the registry, he has not lost one client since he was found to be in violation of the code. So that's an argument as to why administrative penalties are definitely needed. In terms of what you should definitely not recommend changing, Government Relations Institute of Canada said we're not arguing for looser, weaker rules when they were here. They are, actually. They want Rule 8 gutted and turned over to the Ethics Commissioner, and if that's done, then lobbyists will be allowed to do whatever they want for politicians and public officials they are lobbying, and also to give anything they want to them, because the Ethics Commissioner says that there's no conflicts of interest created when lobbyists fundraise for politicians they're lobbying and things like that. So the GRIC does want looser, weaker rules, and you should not gut Rule 8. It's the most important thing.
Thank you, Mr. Conacher.
We spent 10 years in court trying to finally get it enforced, and if it's gutted now, you're going back to the free-for-all where there'll be trading favors again, as there was back to Confederation.
Thank you, Mr. Conacher. Mr. Chenier, we're over time, but did you have a very brief comment on this?
Well, very brief. The difficulty has always been to define what lobbying is, and that has always been the loophole that people have used. It was initially an attempt to influence, and therefore, for the first 10 years, we had lobbyists calling, just getting information. They weren't attempting to influence the decision, and then they would advise their clients, and they did not have to register at all that activity. When the attempt to influence was removed and just contacting a public official, that brought more people out to register. But it seems to me that the definition of lobbying, as Ms. Yates has said, has to be expanded to include the preparatory work, the strategizing, and everything else, which is what good people do. Thank you. Sorry.
Mrs. Davidson for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair, and thanks to our witnesses here today. Certainly it's excuse me, certainly been interesting presentations. Just going back, Mr. Chenier, to what you were talking about with the definition of lobbying. You were just getting started on telling us a little bit about it, and Ms. Yates, you also said that you would support keeping the 20% rule but broaden the definition. And so I would ask each of you to, if you could expand a little bit more on how you would broaden that definition. And one specific question I have, some of the witnesses talked about travel time being, excuse me, being included in that 20% time. So maybe you could address that a little bit as well.
Well, I'm afraid I have to disagree somewhat with Ms. Yates on the 20% rule. I think it does have to be changed. I think it does have to be removed, and removed in such a way that we don't include all the people who are coming, on lobby days or things like that, constituents, but on the other hand does capture what I consider to be the major loophole of people coming and being very active in a campaign for maybe 2 or 3 days and being very effective in their lobbying, but not appearing at all on the registry. The definition of lobbying, the lobby community, by and large, from the period, say, 1889 to 2000, took a choice as to whether or not they wanted to register, simply by, it was really, do they want to be visible on the registry or not? It was not compulsory for most of the paid consultant lobbyists, because they don't really do a lot of lobbying on their own. They do a lot of information gathering. They know who to see. They do all these other things. And so long as they didn't have to arrange the meetings, they didn't have to register. So they could, what we say, take on an undertaking, advise the client, design the lobby campaign, tell everybody who to see, gather all the information that they needed about where the government stood on the issue, who was going to make the decision, when it was going to be made, and then bring in the troops, which was normally the client who understood the issue, to come in and visit the government officials. And so long as the other people made arrangements for these meetings. Again, this was not registrable activity. They could come into town, spend 3 or 4 or 5 days making their case, pressing their issue, and leave town, and there would be no trace whatsoever on the registry of that lobby campaign happening. None. And legally it was not required. When they changed the rule from an attempt to influence to contacting a public official, then that activity became visible. If you were contacting a public official to get information, you were skirting it whether or not you decided to register, so most people decided to register. But we still have people who can plan a strategy, know who to speak to, advise people who to talk to, what the issues are, get people to find the current information, and they don't appear in the registry at all. And so that comes down to your definition of what is lobbying. And if that includes you have an undertaking, you're advising a client on what to do, then to me that's lobbying. Whether or not you then do the personal contacting is irrelevant.
Okay, Ms. Yates?
Sur la règle du 20%,
With regard to the 20% rule, I think the objective is the same. In other words, we really want to be able to target the real, true lobbyists so that a citizen or a community organization that simply appears at the office of an MP once a month isn't registered. Mr. Chenier is saying that we have to find system rules to establish that distinction between real lobbyists and occasional, let's call them that, occasional lobbyists. The 20% rule is a tool that we've found. It's not perfect, but it's something we found so as to make this distinction, saying if you do lobbying during more than 20% of your time, then you are a real lobbyist. The problem is that since the definition doesn't or only includes that portion of communication with the public office holder, all of the activities Mr. Chenier mentioned aren't taken into account. If we broaden the definition to include all of those activities, including travel time indeed, then most of the time lobbyists would reach that 20% threshold. And in that case, we would really be able to target true lobbyists. And occasional lobbyists, the person who goes to visit his MP once a month, wouldn't reach most probably that 20% and wouldn't have to register. So the 20% rule isn't perfect. We could always try to skirt it. But if we broaden the definition, I believe that that would allow us to respect the spirit of the act behind that threshold rule of 20%. And what we mustn't change, coming back to the other MP's question, in Quebec, we have a distinction between lobbying done by for-profit organizations versus lobbying done by non-profit organizations. And as I explained in my brief, this creates selective transparency, and to my mind, with this double standard, it's a problem, and we shouldn't have a double standard system where non-profit organizations wouldn't have to register. So that's the danger as well if we eliminate the 20% rule. And to conclude on that, if we look at the U.S., the fourth largest or most important lobby group there is the American Association of Retired Persons, which is a non-profit organization. So among the things that we shouldn't change, that's one of them. Mr. Dussault for 5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a few questions to put with regard, first of all, to the Bruce Carson affair that really surprised me. When I heard talk of this, it was much spoken about in the media. And now there are penalties that are very minimal, that are negligible. What could the penalties be if we had any? For example, Mr. Carson, who was lobbying or who could have had a contract worth about $250 million, do you believe that small penalties in Ontario, I think it's $25,000. Do you think something like that would be adequate? And do you think that those individuals who lobby for large contracts like that and who make that much money will really be afraid of that kind of a penalty?
Carson situation points out two things. One, the media found it out, not the Commissioner of Lobbying, and that's part of the scandal. that no audits are being done to find out who's meeting with ministers even. I mean, that would be a very simple thing. The Commissioner has the power to do that under her general enforcement administrative powers currently, but she's not. She's just sitting back and waiting for the media to discover situations. But secondly, someone who is going to profit greatly from a contract doesn't mean you need to have a penalty that equals the size of the contract to get them to register, as long as it's a significant penalty. And I think the penalties that exist in, you heard the commissioners, 3 provinces say they already have that power, and then the Ontario commissioner wants it, and a penalty of $25,000 is adequate, I think. You can't go too high or it becomes quasi-criminal, and then you have an issue of whether an administrative tribunal can, under the Charter, actually levy such a high penalty. So there is a dollar amount above which you can't really go before you'll get into a problem with having an administrative tribunal have the power to levy that penalty.
I would also say that having the power to fine someone communicates a message to the public as well. So if there's a $25,000 penalty and the penalty is indeed applied, then people say, oh, wow, you know, that the maximum was applied here. But when you have no penalties whatsoever other than a mentioning in the, you know, it's sort of like, just you know, that's really bad. It gives the wrong impression as to whether this is really bad or really good or you know. So having that penalty in place and imposing it communicates another message other than just the monetary amount.
Ms. Yates first, and then we'll come back to Mr. Conacher.
Très brièvement, j'appuie.
Very briefly, I'm in agreement with what has just been said. The symbolic value of the penalty is just as important. So I think I would rely on what's being done in other jurisdictions in that regard.
In 5 years and say, oh, we've got administrative penalties, now we're looking, they're not really working. Make them minimum penalties, not maximum. Because if they're a maximum penalty of $25,000, then you'll see the commissioner levy penalties of $500 for the next 5 years. And so set some standards, you know, for various violations, that there'll be minimum amounts paid for sure, and require her to impose them.
Et puis peut-être un petit commentaire sur ce que vous avez dit tantôt, Madame Yates.
Coming back to what you said earlier, Ms. Yates, regarding the 20%, you seem to agree with the idea of retaining a certain percentage, if 20%, if we broaden the definition. Lobbyists, with all of the work that they would do, real lobbyists would fit into that category under the threshold. But I have a question for those who are very influential and who, perhaps with 5% of their time devoted to lobbying and with no preparatory work, perhaps just with a phone call, will really do very influential lobbying work. But they're not at the level of 20%. So you'd have to really broaden the definition. But there again, the 20% is such that some very influential individuals will fly under the radar, because they don't devote 20% of their time to it. Yes, and it must be the person, him or herself, or all of the people working for one and the same organization that reach the 20%. So it's cumulative. If 4 people each do 5%, then you reach the 20% in that way as well. So in that sense, clearly the 20% is a rule. It can't be perfect. Perhaps it could be dropped to 15%. We'd have to look at that. But the fact that it's cumulative allows one to avoid those situations, because the person who makes a phone call, an important phone call, and it only accounts for 5% of his or her activities, that person works within an organization, and other people, other individuals within the organization will be doing similar work. So if it's cumulative, you can quickly reach that 20% threshold.
Mr. Butt for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for being here today. Under the current legislation, we have a very broad definition of designated public office holder. It covers a whole bunch of people. In your view, is that enough? Is it too broad? Should it be more specific? Should fewer office holders be covered? Because there is an argument that's made that some of us don't have perhaps as much influence because we're sitting on the back bench than a cabinet minister or a parliamentary secretary or people working in the Prime Minister's office would have. So are you satisfied with the current definition of who's covered under the DPOH, or do you think it should be broader or narrower from each of your perspectives?
I think for the purpose of transparency, It should be as broad as it is. And it does cover staff. And that's good, because you wouldn't want to allow a politician to be indirectly lobbied by having the person lobby their staff and not register it, because the registration is not required. But for the purpose of the cooling off period, as I've suggested, it should be a sliding scale. So bring some fairness into that part of the act. It was really the only way, without going through passing a bill, that the government could deal with that issue of requiring communications to be disclosed in the response to the Raheem Jaffer situation. But it was too blunt, because it then also extended the 5-year cooling off period to every single MP. And again, there should be a sliding scale for based on your power and influence.
Yes, I think it should be expanded one more level in the federal public service. Right now, it stops at the ADM level, and most policy analysis and development is done below that level, and so most of the lobbying is directed at people below that level. You try and get to the person who's holding the pen as often as possible. So I would suggest, if I were doing it, that it should be down to the Director General level. And further, but unfortunately, then you start to really crowd up the registry. But certainly, the Director General level would be a step in the right direction. And, sorry, and also, it's very unclear to me anyway, and to lobbyists, I think, as well, as to what needs to be reported. And I think we need greater clarity in terms of what contacts need to be reported with public office holders.
I agree with my two colleagues. In the context of transparency, the idea isn't to reduce this, but to retain a broad definition and broaden it even further. But to take into account the cooling off period, I think a cooling off period of 5 years is excessive for a political advisor, the staffer of the office of the leader of the opposition, who hasn't had access to privileged information. So it seems to me that a mobile scale is essential.
We've talked a little bit about the difference between, a formal pre-arranged meeting. Somebody books a meeting, they come to my office, they tell me what their view of the world is, they register that meeting, they go away, versus the casual, I bump into them somewhere, I happen to be at the same restaurant they're at, they come over to the table for 2 seconds and mention something to me as a DPOH. How do you see those casual contacts? Because we bump into 50 or 60 people a day. I can't keep track of what everybody has said to me on every single day on all kinds of different issues in a casual sense versus a structured meeting where they're physically sitting down with me and we're going through something. How do you propose that type of contact or communication being registered? How is the lobbyist, and if the decision is that us as MPs have to keep track of those as well, so that there's some checks and balances, which I think some of the witnesses have said that might be an option for us to look at. How are we going to keep track of all of that?
Well, the lobbyists will disclose it. I mean, that's what the Internet's for. The government's just trumpeted the fact that 250,000 data sets from StatsCan have been put up online and now are searchable in raw data form, so people can manipulate them and put them into applications for mobile phones. I mean, it's easy. These people, if they're required to disclose all communications, they will disclose all communications. If you leave a loophole, the loophole will be exploited. There's a loophole left in the U.S. where you're not allowed to have buy a politician a sit-down dinner. So now they go and stand at the bar and eat snack food. It's not considered dinner food.
Yeah,
So
Mr. Conacher,
you can't leave those loopholes open; they'll be exploited.
Thank you. If you, Ms. Yates and Mr. Chenier, I'll just allow you a brief comment because we're over time.
The question is very interesting, and I would eliminate that distinction between organized versus casual communication, and therefore any communication whatsoever would have to be registered, declared. I know that this was much discussed here in committee, the fact that public office holders would also have to report the communications they've been the object of. I wouldn't move in that direction simply because of the bureaucratic burden it would impose on people. You're all very busy people, and if you had to report all of those communications, I think it would be a very heavy burden, and it isn't necessarily the best way to spend taxpayers' money.
I guess I would say you should know when you're being lobbied or not, whether it's casual or not. And so, I mean, a short encounter on the street, you're going to say is not a lobby, but if someone sort of pins you down and for 10 or 15 minutes explains their position, whether they ran into you in a restaurant or whether they're in your office, you would know that they're lobbying.
Thank you, Mr. Chenier. Mr. Andrews for 5 minutes.
I'm going to come back to that debate in a second, but I want to finish my conversation with Mr. Concha that we started earlier. You said you support the recommendations that the Commissioner has made. They're solid recommendations. And the ones up and above the Commissioner, you talked about the volunteer lobbying. Is that the only one? And when you talk about volunteer lobbying and one friend calls another friend to offer advice, do you have any evidence that this is actually going on?
This is the problem with this issue, is that what's going on is secret. So everyone says it doesn't exist. But there have been rumors, for example, of corporations using retired executives who were no longer employees of the corporation to do their lobbying in the past. And so that what didn't have to be registered because they were being paid a pension, but they weren't being paid as an employee, and therefore did not have to register those calls, even though they might be captured, might spend more than 20% of their retired time doing it.
If one friend calls another friend, how are you going to capture that? How are you going to catch that?
You make it illegal. That's the best you can do. You'll never end either secret donations or secret lobbying, no matter what regime you ever put in. You'll always have Swiss bank accounts and other bank accounts in other countries with secret money in them, and you'll always have secret lobbying. But make it illegal. Require all the communications to be disclosed. And the Commissioner is not requiring all communications to be disclosed. That's one of the flaws with her recommendations. There's just absolutely no reason for it. A person contacts you about your decisions, and I agree with what Mr. Chenier said, at whatever level you're in the public service or opposition party or government, if they're contacting you about your decisions and communicating with you in any way about your decisions, require them, paid or unpaid, whether it's about the enforcement or the administration or the changing of a law, or whether it's 20% of the time, 100% of the time, require them to disclose it. That's what the Internet's for. It'll be searchable, and people will be able to track.
But as a lawmaker, I find it difficult to make a law that you can't enforce.
You can't legislate morality, meaning, every law is violated by someone. So if you use that by analogy, you would never pass any laws, and you would cancel all the laws we have.
But if you can't, most laws that you make are enforceable, and you can get to the bottom of something. If
right.
what
So
you're
what
proposing
we have
is you can't catch anybody.
No, what we have now is a system where it's like a stop sign on a rural road at midnight. When you go through it, there's no one sitting there watching, because one car every half an hour goes through. And that's the current enforcement system we have and the current rules we have. And you need to make it more like some of the toughest rules and laws we have and toughest enforcement systems that we have. You have a better chance of getting caught parking illegally in any city in Canada than you do as a former cabinet minister doing secret illegal lobbying.
So, okay.
That's perverse system.
Let's just park that one for a minute. So there's, outside the recommendations by the Commissioner, that's the only other addition recommendation you'd make?
No, also, as I've said, in terms of enforcement, she's not doing any audits. She's sitting back, and she's not reporting on what she's doing regularly, so we don't even know whether she's doing her job properly. And I'll have more of that on that actually next week, an analysis for you that you can ask her questions about when she's here on the 16th. Lots of complaints that have never been ruled on for years and years. And as well, the other issues of requiring disclosure on amounts spent on lobbying efforts.
Could you after you leave, summarize your specific recommendations?
We have our submission, and the very first page of it has the 10 recommendations on it.
Getting back to the designated public office holder, and I've asked the question a couple of times now about closing the circle, making the some onus on us to report so that someone could match up the context. Do you see value in that? Is that something that we should be doing there now?
30 seconds left, so I'm going to ask the three of you to give a brief response each. Mr. Chenier.
Well, I believe there's a component of the Act right now which allows the Commissioner to call a public office holder and see whether these reports jibe. One could either attack this by having a more proactive Commissioner or by requiring public office holders to disclose. You know,
Ms. Yates.
Très brièvement, dans un monde idéal, oui.
In an ideal world, yes. Given the democratic or rather bureaucratic burden it would create, no.
I don't see any reason why we have this thing called the Internet. It's searchable. It's very easy to upload stuff. There's no great burden to put more information on the Internet.
Great, thank you. And Mr. Del Mastro.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Some of the comments that have been made today, I have to say, are bordering on ridiculous. If something's secret, illegal, I have no idea how you can possibly constitute that these things even occur, because if they do, I'm certainly not aware of them. And if it's secret, you're not aware of it. So it seems to me that you're impugning the reputations of a lot of good people. And in fact, I would argue some of the things that you're suggesting, Mr. Conacher, would actually persuade good people not to even run for public office, because you want to track people after they leave office into their private life. I just think there's a lot of good people, probably that have an interest in this file, that are listening to this committee today, that are probably saying, "My goodness, once again I'm being painted with a brush of somehow being sleazy or unethical," or there are people that work in GR that are just good people, and they don't have their morals are not in my view not something that most Canadians would have any. Their motives and their morals and everything about them is decent, and they provide a public service. And it seems to me in some of your testimony what you're suggesting is that Ottawa is ran and influenced by a bunch of secret, sleazy influence peddlers that are in fact directing money. And I've got to tell you, I've been here 6 years. That is not my experience.
Actually, I haven't said anything that you've attributed to me.
It's what you're...
I have said the system would not catch anyone doing that. That's all I've said. I haven't said anyone is doing it. I haven't said anyone has the motive to do it. The system would not catch them. Now, in terms of 5 years after you leave, you do have to report, if you're a former public office holder during that 5-year cooling-off period, to the Commissioner of Lobbying if you are doing lobbying. So the law already covers people in the 5 years into their private lives. The Conservatives brought that in. So I guess you disagree with your government's own bill that made that change that, according to you, invades people's lives for 5 years after they leave office.
No, I was making that comment.
The fundamental issue is conflict of interest. We're trying to prevent conflicts of interest. We're trying to have ethical government that's open, and the system does not require open, ethical government right now because the commissioner's not doing audits. So it's very easy for a former cabinet minister to be doing communications, and they can do them without having to register, and it's all legal. So as a result, you have a system that's wide open to abuse, but I have not said once that anyone is abusing it. I've said the system is the scandal because it allows for abuse legally.
But I think it's fair to say that in your communications, you're leading people to believe that these holes are there, and because these holes are there, these things are happening. And,
I have never said it. I've never said it in the last 18 years.
But that is...
Del Mastro has the floor, and Mr. Conacher will have an opportunity to respond.
I'm just suggesting that that's the innuendo in your comments lead people to believe that that's the system we have in Ottawa, and it's not.
You're inferring something that I have not implied.
Okay, fine. I do want to ask you about Rule 8, people that are opposed to Rule 8 or certainly find Rule 8 confusing because it isn't always applied consistently, or if it's applied consistently, they're not always aware of what the rules are. They contend that they are a voter. They have democratic rights. Participating in their democracy is something that they feel that they shouldn't be excluded from. I'm sympathetic to that argument. I understand your concern around how loyalties may in fact affect people's judgment later on, but I haven't seen that. Now, what would you say to these individuals that are in fact covered by Rule 8? And by the way, I'm not suggesting we repeal Rule 8, but their argument, could you respond to their argument that it's taking away their democratic right to participate in democracy?
The Federal Court of Appeal has already ruled unanimously on that and said you have to prevent conflicts of interest. You don't have democratic good government if you don't. And when a lobbyist does something that causes the politician or public official to feel an obligation to return the favor because it's a gift or it's services provided of fundraising or whatever, that then the lobbyist has crossed the line and created a conflict of interest. Every Supreme Court ruling, every court ruling in most developed countries in the world says the same thing. The UN, the OECD, all the standards. You have to prevent conflicts of interest. And Rule 8 does, finally, after we spent 9 years in court to finally get a Federal Court of Appeal ruling that rejected an old interpretation of Rule 8 that didn't prevent anything. Didn't prevent lobbyists from doing anything. So now it's finally enforced and it has to be upheld.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. John Master and Mr. Conacher. I have one brief question for Ms. Yates. Ms. Yates, you're talking about the 20% rule and maintaining it. Some other witnesses had raised the issue around travel time, and you mentioned travel time. And those of us from the western part of this country can take up to 10 hours of travel, and somebody that's in downtown Ottawa can drive across the street. Are you still suggesting that travel time is included in the activities, and how do you compensate for those vastly different travel schedules in this huge country of ours?
J'inclurais dans la définition du lobbying l'ensemble.
I would include in the definition of lobbying all preparatory activities. And in that context, if we broaden the definition of lobbying to include preparatory work, I believe that travel time would be a relatively minor element, 1 hour versus 10 hours. If you're including all the preparatory time, it wouldn't be a discriminating factor because there'd be all sorts of other efforts and activities behind the scenes, and the travel time would be included along with all of the preparatory work. So I really don't think that in the context of a broadened definition that travel time would be a discriminating factor.
I want to thank our witnesses for coming today and providing some challenging questions and comments for the committee to consider. I want to thank committee members for your participation. Meeting adjourned until Tuesday.